For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Globe. I am Surya Gangadharan, and our focus this evening is on the auction of 5G spectrum for the first time for 5G mobile telephony services. The auction began yesterday on Tuesday, sorry, and is concluding today. I have a small graphic here to tell you exactly what is at stake and what has happened so far. First of all, bids amounting to 1,45,000 crore for 5G airways have been received. The major bidders, there's no surprise there, are Reliance Jio, Airtel, and Vodafone. Now, Adani has clarified that they are not interested in mobile telephony services, that their interest in 5G is limited to digitizing its many businesses. The airwaves are for auction on the low band. You can see the figures out there. The mid band and the high band, which is 26 gigahertz. My guest this evening is Jaijit Bhattacharya. You met him before on our channel. He is the head of the Center for Digital Economy Policy Research. Welcome, Jaijit. India's first ever 5G spectrum auction, and it seems to have gone off smoothly. In revenue terms, the government seems to have got more than what it expected. What is your take on the developments so far?
Thank you, Surya. Thank you for having me at your show. I think it's been a very encouraging development that we got, roughly speaking, about $18 billion of spectrum licenses already. But do keep in mind that this was after the government reduced the reserve price by 40%. So we were expecting about 100,000 crores of license revenue coming in. We got 145,000 crores. So it's almost a 40% hike in what we were expecting. But that's against the backdrop that we had actually reduced our reserve price by 40%. Also, do keep in mind that US went through similar auctioning of spectrum, and they had a total of over $100 billion in terms of spectrum revenue. So yes, what we have got yesterday of $18 billion in terms of spectrum revenue is great, but the US got much more. And US has 400 million population. We have got 1 billion population, or 1.4 billion population. In fact, it's more than 3 times the population of US. So clearly, we still have a lot of catching up to do in some sense. However, having said that, there is no reason for ordinary citizens to celebrate that there has been more money being put in for the spectrum, because eventually that money is going to be paid by you and me. So
Yeah.
in a way, it's a indirect taxation that's coming onto us. So when we use the spectrum and when we use the services of Airtel, of Jio, of Vodafone, we will end up paying a higher charge, which will then go into paying for the spectrum charges that are being paid for by these operators.
So, in that sense, the auction of spectrum that we did is broadly in line with what happens in other parts of the world.
Not necessarily so. If you look at Japan as an example, as they call it, they essentially had a beauty contest of the operators. And based on who has promised to roll out more equipment and therefore provide more jobs, had been given larger spectrum. So it was not an auction. In fact, in Japan, Docomo actually asked the government to auction it, because there are certain pluses and minuses of auctioning. If you go by a certain plan and you submit it, and the government says, "I'm going to give you the spectrum based on your plans," then you're stuck with that plan. If the market situation and the ground situation changes, you're not allowed to change that plan, and which is very constraining. But on the other hand, if you have bought the spectrum, you're free to change your plans as and when is required. So also, what about spectrum holding? If you have given it based on a beauty contest, and let's look at it from an Indian perspective. We did have the plan of first come first serve spectrum being allocated for the 2G auction, quote unquote auction. So allocation, let's say, which led to the whole 2G quote unquote scam, where it happened or didn't happen. But there was a lot of problem from an Indian perspective. What if people go ahead and have holding of spectrum. They don't want to roll out the services. They'll hold the spectrum, then they'll sell it to others, and so on and so forth, which is something we don't want. So possibly the Indian situation, auctioning works well, but China, Japan, they have followed other models where they have allocated the spectrum, which essentially brings down the cost of connectivity and telephony, and that's something that India badly needs. We are definitely the cheapest in terms of connectivity cost among any major economy, but the lesser the cost of connectivity, the more jobs will get generated, the more business models will get enabled, and therefore there will be an overall prosperity in the country. So it is not necessarily correct to have an auction, but given the precedence and the context in which India operates, perhaps we were not left with any other option.
And the
Surya,
various,
just to add to that, sorry,
yeah,
something else that's coming to your mind since you asked that question is there has also been proposals to have a hybrid model, which is that have an auctioning for areas which have got high demand. Let's say for Delhi, Lucknow, Bombay, Chennai, we have an auctioning, and for places where there is low demand, like the Gumlas and Araku valleys and so on and so forth, there you have first come first serve of a spectrum allocation. So that ensures that you have players who have paid for the spectrum. They're forced to go ahead and roll out the services as quickly as possible because they put money onto the spectrum. And for areas where there is not much of a demand for connectivity, at least you bring down the prices. We give the spectrum at a lower price or at no price, based on first come first serve service, and then some penalty if they don't roll it out within time. So there are various possibilities of spectrum allocation, that is possible, and perhaps in the next round, India should consider the other options that are there.
tell me the various bands that were auctioned. These are for specific services. I mean, there's a general public out there which would like to know.
So it's not just specific services. It depends on multiple things. If you have a band which is lower frequency, let's say 700 megahertz, which were freed up because we are not broadcasting television anymore. So the old television technology, which used to broadcast television signals, I think many of the millennials have not even such seen such a
Yes.
television set. So one used to broadcast television signals. Now, since that has stopped, those spectrums are available. Now, the good part about these, low frequency spectrum is that they have a much longer range. So you can have one television tower which covers 26, 30 kilometers because of the low frequency of these spectrums. So therefore, if you are in a less congested area where the number of subscribers to your service is very low, you would not like to go around putting too many towers. You would like to have one tower which uses something like a 700 megahertz spectrum, which covers a large part of the geography. But keep in mind that because it's 700 megahertz, its information carrying capacity is less because also the spectrum available, the band available is very low. If you look at, let's say, on the other side, 26 megahertz or 26 gigahertz, there you have 3.25 gigahertz available. Now, when the frequency goes up, you can therefore send massive amount of information, right? And when we're talking about the magic of 5G, that essentially happens at higher frequency. But when the frequency goes up, the range reduces very significantly. And therefore, you have to put up a large number of base stations, so the capital cost goes up. Now, the capital cost going up can be supported in high density areas like Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and so on and so forth. If you go to tier 2, tier 3 cities, when the density starts reducing, it may not be economically sustainable to have a high capital cost supporting the higher frequency range, and therefore the sweet spot may be the mid-band ranges, which has both a decent range while also providing significantly more bandwidth than 4G provides, and therefore that essentially ensures what is the kind of service that you'll deliver, where will you put up which kind of a band, and how much of capital expenditure you will have, and therefore you bid more for the 700 megahertz frequency because your capital expenditure goes down, but the quality of service that your customers will get will be not the same as somebody who's getting a 26 gigahertz kind of a frequency. Also, Surya, do keep in mind that a lot of 5G enabled handsets have also already been rolled out in this country. And I haven't come across any statistics of what are the bands that they're supplying. not all of the 5G phones are supporting all the bands. So unless the 5G operators are operating at multiple bands, some of these phones will be useless. They'll be piece of brick in terms of a 5G support. So they will only be able to support 4G if they are not supporting all the bands that we're talking about.
Jaijit, I have a question here. This is a little political. Government has allocated 1 lakh crore to revive BSNL and BBNL. Why are they wasting money, etc., etc., etc.? What's your take?
So BSNL does have responsibilities beyond just being a telecom operator. However, having said that, the counterpoint always has been same as in airlines, is that let the government buy these services from private sector. Why have an entire company being put out there which is not making profits and therefore eating into taxpayer money year after year? So I think we need to have a larger debate on why should BSNL and now BSNL plus BBNL, because BBNL is getting merged into BSNL, be sustained. But do keep in mind that BBNL is rolling out the BharatNet project, which is one of the largest telecom projects in the world, and it's a very major responsibility, and we don't have any other institutional framework within the government to really support such a large rollout of telecom network happening. And therefore, there are some existing responsibilities that BSNL and now BSNL plus BBNL has to do. And also, there are certain areas where the current private sector operators do not cover, which is only covered by BSNL. As I said, again, those areas can be auctioned out, and private sectors can be asked to bid for those tenders, and the government can pay them to roll out these services, and it will definitely cost much lower than what we are spending on BSNL. So clearly, it's a debate that we must have, possibly not in the current context of the 5G auctioning, but it really is a debate that we should look at.
Now, given, let's assume, what about the army, the armed forces? Do they get something separately? Who handles that?
So that's something I've been talking about for quite some time. I've been writing about it. Just like Adani actually bidded for connectivity for their enterprises. In fact, there was a lot of debate whether enterprises should be given any allocation of 5G spectrum. And I've always been saying that the army, the navy, if you have your entire ship, don't you need a 5G spectrum to do the connectivity within your ship? And the ships are pretty large. Similarly, the military, similarly the air force, they would need the connectivity. But I haven't heard of any specific allocation being done for these services. Also, for that matter, Adani has been able to go ahead and bid for spectrum for connectivity within its own enterprises. But what about other enterprises? What about the Tatas? What about Mahindras? What about many other
Yeah,
enterprises?
yeah.
They all need this connectivity. So will they be getting? Will there be a separate auctioning of spectrum for the enterprises, or will they be dependent on Airtel and maybe Adani and Geo to provide the connectivity? So this is an interesting debate that has yet not been resolved. We haven't heard the last word on it. It seems that the government is probably not inclined to provide spectrum to enterprises, because the counter argument from the telecom operators was that if such spectrum is provided to enterprises, then that's a loss of market for the telecom operators, and therefore they will bid a lower amount. And therefore, their point was that fine, if you want to give allocation to enterprises, please go ahead, but reduce the reserve price, because we will not be making that much money because that market goes away. Having said that, it also stifles innovation, because if the corporates and the enterprises get these spectrum, they can do very innovative things on top of it, which we would look forward to having, and that's really what will move innovation in this country. But as I said, at the end of the day, we haven't had any clarity from the government.
What about rural areas? Do they? We have this entire impressive and ambitious, program to connect every village. How do they plug into 5G?
So in a way, 5G is the last mile, right? And the backhaul is the network I was talking about, which is the BharatNet project. So the backbone of India will be BharatNet, and I think 5G and BharatNet needs to be looked at in that context. They are complementary to each other. Otherwise, the cost of network goes up in India because every single entity will then have to roll out the
Yeah.
backbone. So when you put up a tower, who connects the tower to the rest of the network? It has to be a fiber optic connectivity that we put into place. So what we see in terms of BharatNet is the fiber will be rolled out to each village, and then from the village, either people use 5G or they use Wi-Fi or use some other last mile distribution technology, which will enable the villagers and everybody else to plug in onto the global network, the internet. That part has actually been left open. So will it be BSNL stepping in and providing that? We don't know because there is a cost attached to the 5G equipment, and there has to be
Yeah.
enough people out there to be able to pay for that cost. Eventually it is you and I who will pay for it. It's not that Airtel is putting in an investment. It is we who have to pay for that investment. And if they're paying for the spectrum, it's essentially we who have to pay for the spectrum. So if there are only 5,000 people in a village, will that lead to payback on the equipment that's been put up over there? Probably not. Probably not at the current techno-economics that is out there, unless there is a significant change in the telecom infrastructure and we can provide the solutions at a much lower rate. And that has happened earlier. If you look at the Wi-Fi boxes, they used to cost $50,000 when the first Aloha
Yeah.
protocol in Wi University came up. And from $50,000 now it's less than $50 that we are paying for the Wi-Fi boxes. So it is quite possible that in 5G we may have a dramatic lowering of cost, especially with indigenous equipment coming in. But till the time that doesn't happen, I think we are a little far off from having the villages be connected with 5G.
Also, Adani entered the field a little later, and there was a lot of speculation, even hype about what he was going to do. Then he clarified. But how do you see Adani's late entry into this entire situation?
So I think it was quite clear that they're not bidding for large spectrum based on the deposits that given, the earnest money deposits that they had given. It was a fraction of what others had paid. But clearly, India needs more than two and a half players that we have right now. And
Yep.
I'm calling Vodafone as half a player because it is obviously fast becoming a government owned entity given the large share that government has, which they took in lieu of the payments that Vodafone had to make to the government. But having said that, Vodafone has still not reached a financial stability. So if they vanish, it's a huge problem for the country. Now, what exactly is the problem? Obviously, the consumers lose out because there isn't enough competition. But also, the government loses out because if they are having auctioning of any resource, and in this case, the spectrum resources, and if you have only two players bidding for it, then they can actually collude or they can, figure out what each one of them will bid, and they will not be bidding at an optimal level. And therefore, having Adani as a third player coming in makes a lot of sense. Now, what Adani has stated is that they are interested in only doing connectivity of their own enterprises. Now,
Yeah.
that gives them a lot of technical capability. It is not easy to just jump in and start competing with a Geo or an Airtel or any other telecom company which has got a decade plus of experience. In fact, even for Geo, they had actually set up Reliance Infocom, and
Yeah.
they had the ability to actually set up telecom networks and then scale up, and therefore they could roll out Geo that quickly. But in case of Adani, they have got no prior experience. So my guess and hope is that they are testing the waters, they're building up their capability, and maybe in the next auctioning they'll go for a larger amount of spectrum and actually start providing services to people, and that will lead to an increased competition in the country in the telecom sector, both for consumers and for the government.
So, in the current scenario, you would say Geo has an edge, a dominant
They
edge.
clearly have an edge. They clearly have an edge also because they have got much lower legacy equipment. They don't have 2G, 3G network to support. They went off on a clean slate of 4G network and now they're moving to 5G. So clearly they have an edge, and they seem to be bidding for a lion's share of the spectrum, given that they have put an earnest money deposit of over 14,000 crore.
Yeah.
So they are clearly the largest player out there. Do keep in mind that when I'm saying there's no competitor to these telecom players, the competitors are still 4G, 3G that is out there. So if Geo does not have enough spectrum, they will lose out in terms of the 3G, 2G spectrum that Airtel has, and therefore Geo does need to bid much more aggressively and get hold of more spectrum in order to be able to compete in all the other areas that Airtel isn't. They still have the 3G, 4G, the 3G, 2G spectrums, which Geo does not have. So Geo will clearly emerge as a large player because 5G is the way to go, and pretty soon we will be having 6G with satellite capability coming in, maybe 4 to 5 years from now, if not earlier. So having a larger 5G spectrum and being able to capture customers who need that kind of data will then ensure that you get the cream of the customers. So you get the high paying customers into your network quickly, which has been the bane of Geo. If you realize, if you see what has happened, is that a lot of churn has happened with both Geo and Airtel. But Airtel has ended up being more profitable with less number of users. And they have been able to do that because their profitability per customer has been much higher, and because they got a better quality customers. Now with more 5G spectrum coming to Geo, maybe that will change, and maybe Geo will be able to garner better quality customers, and therefore their ARPU, the ARPU, which is the average revenue per user, will go up, and will help them get more profitability.
You think initially 5G will be more popular among the industrial users, or will it be the mobile telephone consumer crowd?
I think it will be most popular with the millennials and the kids who are playing games and so on and so forth. The reason being that, look, your and my work is happening. I think 4G is pretty sufficient for
Yeah,
the kind of
absolutely.
work we do, right?
Absolutely.
So we don't need gigabytes of data pouring into our phone, eating up our phone battery power and so on and so forth. So clearly, it'll be the gamers, it'll be those who need entertainment. Kind of reports we download is not more than 2 MB, 3 MB. So 5 seconds this way, that way doesn't make any difference to us. But it's really the millennials, and then from there there'll be a large number of industrial use cases that'll be coming up. Automobile to automobile connectivity, train connectivity, device connectivities. So there'll be large plethora of business cases and business models that'll be coming up based on the fact that 5G really operates at a very, very different speed. They provide 10 times the speed that 4G provides. And I think the other thing that we really need to look at is the blind spots. 2G had huge amount of blind spots. 3G did not go do away with it. 4G, continues to have blind spots. We hope with 5G we can, and with more capital investment in 5G, we can reduce the number of blind spots, and that will be something useful for regular corporate users and people like you and me.
Jaijit, earlier you mentioned about the cost of the equipment coming down as we indigenize. Is there a timeline for this? I mean, uh, are there milestones there?
So it's a no. The government has not put in any milestone, but you will realize that we are one of the last ones to do the 5G auction among all the major economies. We're clearly the last one. The first set of countries went live in 2019. By 2020, even during COVID, there was 5G rollouts happening. In fact, you would have heard of the myths where people were blaming 5G for the spread of COVID,
Yeah.
and people were actually pulling down the 5G network. So we are really late, and one of the reasons we are late is a conscious decision that we should provide time to indigenous equipment manufacturers to actually create the equipment and then start manufacturing. Beyond that, the Indian government really believes in a level playing field and an open playing field. We do not stop others from leveraging the market, and therefore there's no timeline as such that has been put in. Having said that, people who are working on indigenous equipment are working very furiously. They are burning the night oil, trying to get the equipment out in time. And I personally believe that by next year we will have very significant amount of equipment coming in being indigenous. Also, do keep in mind that there is a need for certification of equipment that is being imported. In fact, 1st of July 2022 was supposed to be a deadline beyond which no further equipment can be brought in without that certification. But however, because we have been really trailing in terms of 5G rollout, that deadline has been pushed to next year. So it's now 1st July 2023. So there is a breathing time for people to actually start importing equipment. But if there is indigenous equipment being manufactured, there is a competitive advantage because the certification becomes that much simpler, easier for indigenous equipment because we know the source of the equipment, we know the codes gone into it, and it will not compromise our networks. And therefore, that's really the push that's coming from the government side. But there is no deadline as such.
So, last question. The government intends to roll out 5G services by the end of the year. Is this realistic? I mean, what's your sense?
Yes, it is because it has to be one has to define what is rollout. If you say it's a rollout in a few colonies in a few metros, that is definitely happening, right? And with the change in the policy on certification of equipment, now you don't need to really wait for a year before the equipment gets certified. You can
Yeah.
import the equipment very quickly. You can roll it out in a few places in Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and so on and so forth, and you can have the 5G services being beamed in India. So the answer to your question is yes. I think the more pertinent issue to look at is how widespread will be the rollout by the end of this year. I think it'll be quite limited. It'll be limited to the major cities, and within the major cities, it'll be limited to a few hotspots. The central business districts, the areas where there is a lot of commercial activity. So that's where the 5G will start from, and that's perfectly fine. It is impossible to have a larger coverage than that in that short period of time.
But it'll be largely urban centered.
It will be urban centered to begin with because that's where the paying customers are. As I mentioned, it's a factor of the economics of scale. If you got 20 million people living in Delhi, then it's much easier to roll out the equipment because 20 million people can pay for that equipment.
Yeah.
But if you're rolling it on Hapur or Meerut, where they're hardly a million city, they have almost just a million population, then their paying capacity will be much lower. The telcos are clearly going through a bad patch in terms of profitability. On top of it, they will have the additional burden of paying for these spectrums, although it's a deferred payment that they're going into. But having said that, because they have a large exposure and they need to quickly show profitability, it is a no brainer that they should focus on metros, and that's exactly what they will be doing.
Any last word on what the government revenue figures will finally look like? Would it
So I
be
think the
more than what
government
they've already talked about?
they had at one point in time looking at 400,000 crores.
Oh,
So let's see. I think by end of day today or tomorrow we'll get to know what the final figure is. But I think as we celebrate a successful auctioning of 5G, and I hope there will be a successful rollout of 5G, the government also starts focusing on 6G, and more importantly, having our intellectual properties into 6G, our intellectual property rights into 6G, and we get a larger control of 6G. So we had missed the 4G bus completely. We don't have any IPR in 4G. In 5G, we did a far better job thanks to many of the academicians, the IITs, the director of IIT Kanpur, and many other people who are involved. I think we need to be far more aggressive when 6G starts getting rolled out. We still have limited intellectual property in 6G as it's being created. I think this is while we are celebrating the rollout of 5G, we should start working very furiously on the 6G standards and rollouts.
and 6G, nobody has really figured out what the standards are. It's still up in the air.
So roughly we know it will be a connectivity between satellite and the regular GSM phones and so on. So there'll be no black blind spot anywhere. You can go to the top of Mount Everest and be able to call on your mobile phone. So roughly we know what it will be, but it is for us to define, and that's precisely a problem. In 5G, we came in late and we said we need to have special standards for slow-moving transport vehicles, which is a very special requirement for India. So we have very special requirements which we should be able to push in and have our IP on it in the while when the 6G network is getting rolled out. And I think that'll be something very interesting to look at.
Great perspective, Jaijit. Thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you as always. Thanks
My
very much.
pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Surya.
And for those of you who joined us out on this show, you came forward with some of those comments and observations. Thank you. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and other social media. Thank you and good night.